So last week, I saw A Different Man, starring Sebastian Stan and Adam Pearson, and I am obsessed with this movie. I feel like I'm watching a classic, like from the 1970s or something. So I can't wait to break this down from the very beginning all the way to the very end, where we'll talk about Edward's condition and experience, the symbol of the Bluest Eye novel, the hole in the ceiling, and the man who hangs himself. Why Guy never admits he's Edward, the mask in the bedroom scene, Edward's dilemma with Oswald, and why Edward stabbed the trainer. And the entire ending scene with that woman eating alone, Oswald calling Guy Edward, and the final line in the film. So let's get into this deep dive analysis. So when I reflect on this film, I like to split the film into two halves. The first half being focused on the theme of perspective, using the character of Edward. And the second half being focused on the theme of identity, using the persona of Guy. And of course, since I'm covering this film chronologically, let's start with the first half at the very beginning of the film. So the objective of the opening half of the film is to put us in the shoes of a man with facial disfigurement, specifically in Edward's case, neurofibromatosis, a condition in which non-cancerous tumors grow in the nervous system, deforming the skin or bone. And the writer-director of this movie, Aaron Schimberg, has a valuable point of view to capture this experience, since he too has a disfigurement. I'm writing about my own experience. I have a cleft palate, and I'm just expressing my own experiences in this film. And the particular experience of his character, Edward, is a sad one, filled with loneliness, shame, and self-hatred. And this is very well established by the opening score. The opening score is this melancholic, dreary, bleak, lonely piece of music. It's beautiful musically, but it just sounds like hopelessness. And at the end of this opening sequence, we get our first image of Edward's severely deformed face. On the train, we're immediately thrown into the first-hand experience of seeing the reaction of others in public to Edward. Some laugh at him, some try to sneak a peek at him, and it gives you this assumption with everyone else that they're likely looking at him out of curiosity or fear or maybe empathy. And you can clearly see that's what Edward is thinking as well. And this is every day of his life. Even when he reaches his apartment, where we see those people who aren't in shock or have any curiosity because they're already aware of his condition, because they live with him, they still lack this understanding of his perspective very clearly. They're either quietly insulting him, like the guy who says Jesus Christ every time he passes him, or being ignorant about his condition, like the guy who asks what might be the cause in the lump in his neck, like Edward's supposed to know, or trying to encourage him to keep his head up with generic quotes, like the guy who shared that Lady Gaga quote, even though he probably means well. Also, a little earlier on the train, we see a woman reading a novel titled The Bluest Eye, which we much later find out Ingrid and Oswald are reading as well. Set in 1941, the story is about how a young African-American girl is regarded as ugly because of her mannerisms and dark skin. And as a result, she develops an inferiority complex, which fuels her desire for white skin, white culture, and ultimately blue eyes. And the theme of the inferiority complex that exists in The Bluest Eye ties in enormously with Edward's journey in this film. We see this in his gloomy, recoiled body language, his quiet voice, and his lack of enthusiasm or expression. It's almost as if he's continuously apologizing for who he is when he should never at all need to. The only character who shows a unique level of empathy and openness to Edward is Ingrid. Even though, at first, Ingrid doesn't completely understand how to be around Edward and what exactly to say. It's almost impossible. She doesn't have that perspective. So, as we see, she asks about his condition right away, before he refuses to answer the question. And I thought that was a great detail, because honestly, I thought that would be the best thing to do as Ingrid, just to get the elephant out of the room as soon as possible. But the more I thought about it, and the more I watched this film, I realized that Edward's facial disfigurements shouldn't be an elephant in the room. It's just the way he looks. And that familiarity and that perspective of acceptance is what should be normalized in society. And we get our first direct peek into Edward's mentality when we and Ingrid see what he's written on his typewriter. They beg me to show my face, only until they can turn away in horror. And this brief moment of artistic expression from Edward encapsulates the curiosity met with discomfort that people have when they see him. People are intrigued by him for superficial reasons, but also repelled from him also for superficial reasons, and that dehumanizes him in their eyes. And of course, that affects Edward's perspective on himself. We also see him at an audition, since he's an aspiring actor, and his performance isn't great. He's willing to put himself out there, but also has little belief in himself. It's just this hopeless attempt at a role, which is heartbreaking to watch. The career of an actor is likely an ambition he always had, likely before he developed this condition. As we see when he was a child, he didn't have it. And in the audition, when we listen to the words that he's reciting, he recites lines about the hope of one day having a romantic partner, but also seeing the silhouette of himself in his shadow, reminding him of his deformities and hopelessness for such a reality. We also see many shots in the film where Edward looks at other men with very conventionally attractive women. One of those men actually having a facial disfigurement himself, specifically being played by the writer-director, Aaron Schimberg. It all ties in with this constant glimmer of hope that Edward feels that is always quickly shut down by his next interaction with another human being. And also tying in with this monologue and this concept of hopelessness for companionship. Ingrid rejects him when they both look at each other in the eye like they're about to kiss. She second guesses the entire thing and leaves immediately before things get any more complicated for her and for him. And I thought a really powerful shot was when the camera did a close-up on the picture of him and his late mother in the same face-to-face angle as him and Ingrid just seconds ago, capturing that idea of the hopeless fantasy of a woman ever loving him again. He also never bothers to fix the hole in the ceiling, which all ties in with living quite aimlessly, never really having the courage or motivation or seeing the point to report the problem to the building. And also this hole symbolizes, of course, this growing problem that gets bigger and bigger as time goes on that Edward doesn't know how to fix psychologically and in life. There's even this scene at the diner with Ingrid where if you pay attention to the background, every person who walks by outside takes a second look at him through the window. Of course, until we reach the very obvious one who taunts him directly through the window. And in a scene a little later in the film, Edward sees that a man in his apartment has hanged himself. The same man who insulted him and was dating a very attractive woman. This scene to me had an enormous symbolic purpose, that life may look great from the outside, but we have no idea what's going on the inside. Maybe having a beautiful partner who desires you doesn't lead to fulfillment on its own. And maybe the first step of loving yourself is completely mandatory for any eventual partnerships or relationships to be happy ones. And that is the exact lesson that Edward learns when he transitions into Guy in the second half of the film. And considering the point that that scene just made, it is symbolically the turning point for the film thematically, where we shift from the theme of perspective into the theme of identity. And this transition happens perfectly in line with the transition from Edward into Guy. So the treatment begins, and Edward has this boosted anxiety because of the side effects of the medication. From our point of view as the audience, we hear this blaring car alarm with this shaky handheld camera work and this chaotic spiraling musical score. And this medication seems to have an effect on his emotions as well, whether directly or indirectly. He's at his lowest of low points emotionally, screaming and crying in his bed, suffering from the physical and emotional pain. Very soon, fortunately, he begins peeling the deformed skin off of his face, and his natural face without the condition is revealed. And in the next scene, which I absolutely love, we just see him walking around in public for what is signified to be a long while, with the camera tracking from behind over his shoulder. And the reason why he keeps on walking around for so long is to take in the relief and the freedom of looking like everyone else. For the first time in a very long time, no one's double taking, no one's staring, no one's chuckling. This scene perfectly captures the concept of the luxury of obscurity. And when he visits the bar, he's treated like everyone else and can connect with the other guys there. And when he sees that goth, punkish, three-way group sitting at their seat being kind of sexual, he desires some of that sexuality for himself. And in the next shot, the woman who has clearly been fond of him the whole night takes him into the bathroom and does him a favor, let's just say. And I can very confidently say that I have never in my life seen a scene with that specific sexual act happening that was so emotionally powerful at the same time, as he looks in the mirror at a new him entering a completely new life. The film later cuts to Edward as a more successful man in this bigger, more expensive studio bachelor apartment where he's sleeping with one of his coworkers. And very clearly, we can see that over however long it's been, all of Edward's Edward's problems are apparently gone. His life has done this complete 180. He's a successful realtor with a team who celebrates him and women who admire him. However, there's this peaking element of self-abandonment. Like, he has become this new person, but that new person isn't who he truly is inside. Up to this point, there was never any sense of Edward being interested in real estate or one-night stands. He always truly wanted to succeed in the performing arts and truly longed for a monogamous relationship. He even kept this new name, Guy Moretz, that he took on initially. It's almost as if he has decided to be what Guy should be, rather than what Edward always was. And of course, it's this whole concept of inferiority complex and self-hatred that has caused him to abandon his true identity now that he has the chance to, with a new name and literally a new face. And symbolizing all of this, we get this excellent shot of Edward's mask of his old face peeking out from that upper shelf door, and Edward slamming it back behind the door and out of sight, as if he's mentally suppressing this concept of his true self for no one to see. Not even himself. And as the film goes along, we can clearly see that the real Edward still lives within him through his sunken, recoiled, awkward body language, which I thought was a nice touch. And this is proven when Edward sneakily follows Ingrid through the city, and she leads him into her play based on her and his relationship in the past. And what I love about hearing the lines in this play is we get a better insight into Ingrid's particular point of view. We learn through the characters and the dialogue in Ingrid's play that Ingrid wanted to mention Edward's condition, but was unsure of what was and wasn't her business and what was appropriate to say. And of course, when Ingrid sees that Guy perfectly captures the essence of Edward despite not having any disfigurements, she has to cast him and falls for him. And we and Edward see that she has a whole collage of disfigured men on her bedroom wall, where she seems to conduct her research and find the inspiration to write her play. We also see that she's included the quote that Edward wrote on his typewriter when she first met him. And in the next scene, we see that her research and insight has gone into that character of Edward that she's written. We see as the real Edward is playing the character of Edward, he recites lines about having a fragile face and that physiology being assigned to stray from crowds and not draw attention, as if he believes that this is the lonely life he is meant to live. And just as Edward is on stage and about to recite the line, "Don't pull attention to yourself," the camera pans to the audience where we first see Oswald, who does the exact opposite of that line. By that introduction in the theater, and by every other scene with Oswald, he has no problem pulling attention to himself. He's shameless, fearless, confident, and charismatic despite having the exact same condition Edward had. And throughout the rest of the film, we see that being in the presence of this man, Oswald, shakes Edward to his core. Edward abandoned his truest self out of shame, fear, and self-hatred as soon as he got the new face, and Oswald is now a stark reminder of who Edward was, who Edward truly is, and who Edward could have grown to be. So whether Edward had had the procedure done or not, he would have been way happier and much more fulfilled had he embraced his truest self. And Oswald is like this living, breathing symbol of what Edward could have been but never was. And the salt in the wound to this whole thing is how much everyone admires and enjoys Oswald's company, especially Ingrid. And then we have this scene later in the film where Ingrid tells Edward to put the mask on in bed with her because she is more and more longing for the man she is really falling in love with, Edward, not Guy. She's only falling in love with Guy because of the real Edward that exists within him, who comes out entirely when Guy is performing as Edward in her play. That's why when he asks her why she wants him to put the mask on, she says, "It's my creation." That's who she's in love with. The character Guy becomes when he puts that mask on, and the man Ingrid used to know who Guy truly was, and deep down truly is. And that's why when Guy puts the mask on, she's into it at first, but realizes how bizarre it is and breaks into laughter. And this makes Guy even more self-conscious because he feels like she's laughing at him, the true him, Edward. And for the same reason, in other moments throughout the film, when Ingrid calls the mask ridiculous, Edward has this sharp look of frustration and disappointment. So ultimately, with this scene, Ingrid is laughing simply at the absurdity of telling a man to put a mask on to become the true man that she's in love with, subconsciously, while Edward has this deep sensitivity that she's laughing at the real him. And it's unbelievable seeing this tall, dark, handsome, blue-eyed, in shape, successful man look so small in the presence of this severely severely disfigured, thin, small-framed man, all because of a difference in their confidence and self-worth. The dynamic between the two of them really speaks volumes about the value of self-respect and self-esteem. And when Edward sees Ingrid become more and more infatuated with Oswald, it's like watching the woman you love leave you for a truer version of you that she found in someone else. I don't think it gets more crushing and devastating than a reality like that. And I guess you're probably wondering why Edward never just admits who he is. Aaron Schimberg himself has some great insight into this detail. The question I get most is, why doesn't he reveal who he is? And my answer is, he's constantly revealing who he is, but nobody's taking him seriously. Maybe he's not pushing it, but it's also not like him to push it. It's very like Edward to go back into himself and not push it. But in various ways, he says it several times. And I give an example of this. In the same interview, Sebastian Stan highlights how in the first audition, when Ingrid first meets Edward as Guy, he says, "I am Edward. I was born for this role." So while he means it almost literally, of course, Ingrid takes it figuratively. And Edward doesn't have the courage to take it a step further, come out and make it completely clear. And on top of this, I believe Edward also won't admit who he truly is because there's an element of his past that he is still deathly afraid of. The trauma associated with Edward's past is still too frightening and intense to simply return to publicly. And it's at this point when Edward experiences the success of the play, his loss of Ingrid, his loss of himself, and his replacement with Oswald on and off stage. Edward falls into this irreversible downward spiral of identity crisis. He puts the mask on at his real estate job, literally masquerading as this inauthentic version of a fearless, confident version of his old self. It's this final desperate attempt to become the version of himself he always wanted to be, combined with these impulsive acts of frustration. A great example being when he bashes the same hole back into his old apartment ceiling. And the most significant example being when he makes a surprise appearance at the play and tries to literally fight Oswald for the role. But the knockout blow to Edward's psyche is when Ingrid and Oswald have legendary actor Michael Shannon visit to take on the role of Edward in a Hollywood film adaptation of the play. Michael Shannon praises Oswald and Ingrid and charitably gives Edward some slight acknowledgement. Ultimately, the real Edward is being celebrated, praised, and rewarded, but everyone else is getting the recognition and acknowledgement for it. And now, being almost completely immobile because of his injuries, all of his misguided fear and anger and frustration can't be released in any kind of way. So when that physiotherapist trainer makes that harsh remark about Oswald, a disfigured man, all of that anger and frustration and fear and hatred is released in the most horrific act in the entire film. Edward stabs the trainer. In the final scene, when Edward returns from prison, a much older man, Edward learns from Oswald and Ingrid the play about him is no longer revered or respected. Ingrid and Oswald have moved on to bigger, better projects. So in a way, even the legacy that Edward never got a chance to be acknowledged for has been forgotten. There's also this out-of-nowhere crash zoom onto this woman who Edward makes eye contact with and is shaken by. And my interpretation of this woman is she is, or at least represents, the woman who Edward was always meant to meet and fall in love with. But because of his misguided sense of identity and his suppression of truth, he never met the soulmate who he always longed for, well before his condition was cured. This is why we see this woman eating alone and looking at Edward with this deep expression of regret and disappointment. And when Edward looks away, we can see that he has this moment of self-reflection with the same shame and regret for the life that he never meant to live out, where he was supposed to meet this woman. Also, Oswald suddenly calls Edward Edward instead of Guy, which, if you ask me, indicates a desperate fantasy Edward thinks of in this moment where he is finally seen for the real man he is. Yet also, deep down knowing he'll never get to be the man he should have been. And going hand in hand with this idea, when Edward can't pick a menu option, Oswald says, "Old friend, you haven't changed a bit." Conditioned by an ignorant society, shaped by fear and self-hatred, evolution was always completely out of the question. Alright, this is my analysis. I know this video was really long, but I just had way too many things to say, and if there's a detail that you think I didn't cover, I'd be happy to answer it in the comments below, so just let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and see you later.